Hi there, Danny here, and we're continuing our series in the book of Revelation, thinking about who the church is in this time where our normal patterns have been disrupted. And so as we think about the church, I wonder what you would say is a thriving church. Is it a church with grand physical architecture? Is it a church that has people busting out of its seams? Perhaps it's a church where there's lots of varied ministries and programs, or has a big budget, or really good looking people on their social media feed. We don't often think about what a thriving church is, we don't really articulate it, but there's some sense that we identify if a church is healthy or struggling. And so a struggling church is often something where there just sort of doesn't seem to be much life to the people who go there, that perhaps there's not very many people who attend, or that the way that the meeting is conducted in the church service is rather dry and irrelevant. As we come to our second church in Revelations 2 and 3, we arrive in the city of Smyrna. And of the 7 cities that are described in these 2 chapters, this is the one city that has continued on to the present day. Its modern name is Smyrna, and it's a harbour-based city, and back in that day it was a thriving export. It became a city that was very proud of its heritage, and like any great coastal harbour city, it was particularly adored because of its beauty. And at this particular time in the 1st century, it had a great pride because it had been the home for the construction of the temple for the imperial cult. So religiously, this city Smyrna had a great allegiance to the Roman Empire. It was the place where the temple for the Emperor Tiberius was constructed. And so in an age when the government rule of the Roman Empire was also tightly linked with religious observance, where there was a sense that the emperor was a deified being, Smyrna was the home for people's religious expression. But also at that time, it seemed to be quite populous with people of a Jewish heritage. And so the church, which was established probably in one of Paul's mission trips that is described in Acts chapter 19, around 53 to 56 AD, was established in this highly religious city. And the thing that we know about the church is that it seems that it was quite small. Unlike Ephesus that we looked at last week, which gets lots of interactions in the New Testament, the church in Smyrna doesn't get much airtime. So for all intensive purposes, it wasn't a thriving church. It doesn't seem to have a great strategic influence or even a fantastic legacy that can be recounted. But what we see in the message that is given to it is that God has an intimate knowledge of its workings and provides a personal word of encouragement. So let's have a look for that together in Revelation chapter 2, verse 8 to 11. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, "These are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death." What we see in this message is a message of comfort for a very small church that was facing significant persecution. Now, unlike the other letters, there's no word of encouragement, but there's also no word of complaint. This is just a pastoral encouragement to a small church that seems to be facing great obstacles. And so verse 8, to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. It's an encouragement that starts with an affirmation of who Jesus is. He is the sovereign one over all of history. He was the beginning and he'll be there at the end. He's over the past and he looks and holds the future in his hands. And so Jesus is the eternal one whom is to be their source of strength in the face of present adversity. He's the one who will vindicate them as victors despite their obvious present suffering. And so whilst this city that they lived in was proud about its heritage with this temple that they've constructed for the imperial cult to the Emperor Tiberius, Jesus is saying, emperors come and go, but I was there in the beginning and I will be there at the end. And you are mine. And so this is an encouragement based on who Jesus is. And that is an encouragement because this is the one whom they follow. This is the one whom they ultimately trust and worship in their life. And so this reminder echoes what we saw back in chapter 1 verse 18, that Jesus is the one who has conquered the world's greatest obstacle. He's the first and the last. He was dead and behold, he is alive. This church was facing real persecution. Their physical life was under threat. But Jesus here, in his personal message to them, is guaranteeing that he can secure their future and eternal reality. And so this encouragement is the word that they need in a time of great suffering. It's an assurance that ultimately things will go well for them. And their ultimate security is found in the identity of the one whom they trust. And he is intimately aware of their situation. Have a look at verse 9. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. And now again, it doesn't follow the normal pattern in these letters of a commending of their strength and a recognition of their weakness. But what Jesus is relating is empathy for their situation. He understands that they are being afflicted, that they have clear opponents, and these opponents have stripped them of their material wealth and prosperity, and so they are impoverished. And they are not just impoverished of materials, they've been slandered of their reputation. And God knows that. He knows the very specific pressure they're under. He knows the pain of their present reality. And so it seems that what's going on here is perhaps the Jewish community has sought to condemn those in the Smyrna church. And the result of that is that the empire has come and stripped them of their private possessions. And that because of that, they are the laughing stock of the town. They are being slandered. Their reputation has been stripped from them. But despite this, we see that Jesus says they are rich. Now, how can this be? Well, I think the point is that the spiritual and the physical don't always directly correlate. If we think about it today, we could think that perhaps with the vocal opposition towards the church from atheists in our city, or political progressive agendas that want to suppress the voice of the church, that there is something unsatisfactory about how God sees the church. Now, whilst these things that we read in the paper and hear on the news might be visible, really there's also something going on underneath the surface. And today I think there's a battle for truth that's going on in the spiritual climate of the West. And we see here that that Jesus recognises that although the Jews are the ones who have been the catalyst for the persecution that has been experienced by the church in Smyrna, there's actually a spiritual reality against it. And the spiritual driver is God's ultimate opponent. The Prince of Lies, the one who wants to strip faith from the hearts of individuals, Satan himself. Now, on the surface, of course, there would have been people who are seeking, asserting, or wanting to demonstrate power. That's always going to be a threat towards those who follow Jesus. Because those who truly follow Jesus, they don't actually trade in the economy of the things that the world values. If you trust in a promise of life beyond death, if you believe in a God who provides all that you need, then all the insecurities that so often drive our economy and allow people to be manipulated are no longer there. And that is actually deeply confronting to those who are of worldly power. And so I think this is how you can both be materially poor, but at the same time spiritually rich, as Jesus recognises the church in Smyrna is. They're presently homeless, but at the same time eternally secure. Now, if we stop and pause about what this means for us, I think there's a great danger for us in a deeply rich material society to forget this reality. And in doing so, we don't really hold on to this valuable treasure that Jesus offers. I don't know about you, but so often I come to God like he's some genie in a bottle, where I come to him with my prayers, asking him to provide me all the comforts that I can see, the security that I desire, and that ultimately I just want to be like everyone else in the world, to live a healthy, prosperous and satisfying life here and now. But this word of encouragement for the church in Smyrna should be a challenge to us here. That sometimes it's actually when all the things that we can see and touch are stripped from us, that we can fully appreciate the richness of what Jesus has actually provided. Their current persecution provides an opportunity for them to become closer to God. Now, this isn't to mean that churches and Christians should be seeking out persecution in a hope of being spiritually revitalized from it. Ultimately, followers of Jesus are encouraged to seek God first, not seek persecution, but in seeking God first, often it will result in persecution because it challenges the power structures of our world. And I don't know about you, but we see how this reaction is from those who are around us. Our family, when we place God as ultimate. Our friends, when we start to live by the priorities that Jesus affirms. And even in the wider world, in our workplace, there is some resistance when people take Jesus seriously. And often that aversion, that fear, when people see people following Jesus will result in attack. And it will result in adverse situations for those who are following Jesus, and it will be a challenge to continue trusting in him. I wonder where those challenges have been for you recently, where it's been difficult to honour Jesus, where it's just been easier to just give in and live like everyone else. Now, most of the time people aren't sure why they're resistant, but it is helpful to realise that there is a spiritual dynamic at play. And there is an opposition towards people having faith in God, and it comes from Satan. And he's scheming in this world, and he wants people to forget the great promises that have been won through Jesus. And so the words of Jesus for the church in Smyrna, verse 10, do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Now, it's not just that Jesus has arrived after the suffering and he's sort of saying, like a coach at the end of a hard training session, look, you got through it, it's okay, you can rest now. No. The suffering is to come. It's going to be imminent and it's unavoidable. And Jesus doesn't come saying, hey, I'm going to pull you out of this. This is what was on your horizon, but I've got it covered. You see, suffering shouldn't be a surprise for anyone who's following Jesus. And so the small church here in Smyrna, their situation is not a desirable one. But God says, I'm not going to remove it, but I'm going to give you an assurance that I'll be there with you. And so for them, the persecution was probably going to lead to imprisonment. And for them, it was going to face the real possibility of death. So by any measure, this is a desperate situation. But it's not God who's bringing this testing. Jesus says it's actually Satan who's bringing this test. He's wanting to test the faith. But it's not that God is absent in this affliction, but rather he's sort of like a car manufacturer who allows their new prototype to be sent to the testing agencies to make sure that it measures up against all the standards. God is confident that the faith that he has gifted his people will pass the test. And he's still in control. This will only last a period of time. This idea of the 10 days. God will allow Satan to bring this test, but it's in a defined period that he remains sovereign over. So friends, when we face tough times, we can remember that God is here. He is near, and he will ultimately conquer whatever it is we face. And so, the exhortation for the church in Smyrna, verse 11, whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. This exhortation to listen invites them to participate by faith, to trust Jesus as they face this real imminent attack, to not compromise their faith, to not just give in and say what their attackers want them to say, but rather to entrust themselves to the one they love. This has been their heritage. They've endured suffering and they've been faithful. And the encouragement is to remain faithful as suffering comes ahead. And the great hope is that the God who has started a good work in them will bring it to realization. They will be victorious. And Paul here says, Jesus here says that they will never experience the second death. And so it's sort of what was stated positively there in verse 10, that they'll receive the crown of life, is now stated negatively, that they will never die. Both of them is this holding of the promise, the inheritance that Jesus has won. That's where they're to cast their eyes in the midst of tough times. So what are the lessons for us? Well, the pressures that the church in Smyrna faced were those of being materially impoverished, of being slandered for their belief, of being directly persecuted to the point of fearing for their own life. And the exhortation for them was to not be afraid, was to have a peace in the midst of present turmoil, and to be faithful. Be faithful even to the point of death, knowing that they will receive the gift of life. The gift of life assured by the one whom death could not contain. Friends, being victorious as a follower of Jesus doesn't guarantee that there'll be no persecution. In fact, there's a sense that trusting in Jesus will bring opposition. That following the suffering servant will bring present suffering in varying degrees for ourselves. A thriving church, therefore, is a church that can deal well in the midst of persecution, who doesn't just then conform to what the attackers are wanting them to be. This very progressive, all-inclusive, truth-absent church. But also not a church that riles their back up and responds to slander with the very same kind of antagonistic slander. Friends, a thriving church is one who is not afraid of their persecutors, who responds with an attitude of grace rather than angry retaliation. Friends, we live in a day where people are dividing over any and every issue, where it's really easy for those who follow Jesus to want to establish themselves in a camp and then to retaliate with their own public and vigorous arguments, to respond to attacks by squashing those who attack them. This is not the way of those who follow the one who came in grace and peace. The church that is thriving is one who can love their enemies, who responds to attacks not with retaliation but with grace and mercy. The church that is willing to express their belief in truth in a clear and undefensive way. Ones who can maintain relationships with their enemies despite their differences of belief. Friends, I think the persecutions for us in Australia might be family tensions that never get resolved. It might mean friendships that are forever lost. It might mean in your workplace that you never get promoted upon a level, or in fact, increasingly, it might mean that you even get fired for your membership in a church. But I think we've got a lot to learn here from churches that perhaps we've never heard of. So please continue watching the video from Voice of the Martyrs and be encouraged about what it looks like to not be afraid and to remain faithful to the end.